In June 1962, many workers at a US textile manufacturing facility fell ill. They complained of feeling nauseous and developed a rash on their skin. It was suspected that they'd been bitten by some sort of bug. However, subsequent investigations showed that, well, there was no bug. And despite the best efforts of the health authorities, scientists and the company itself, no cause for the nausea and the rash could be found. A couple of years later, in England, Blackburn to be precise, 1965, pupils, school children, were outside waiting on Princess Margaret to arrive to open the recently refurbished Blackburn Cathedral. They were standing outside in the hot sun, and quite a few of them fainted. The cause? Probably standing outside in the hot sun. But a day later, at a school in Blackburn, a girls' school, about 100 pupils fainted, complaining of feeling ill and sometimes having involuntary muscle contractions. The health authorities were alerted. They laid out mattresses, they treated the girls and helped them as best they could. The cause? Just like the textile manufacturing facility, unknown. Although it was later referred to as possibly being an example of hysterical contagion or mass hysteria. These days, we might call it emotional contagion. Let's investigate. Using several articles, again links in the description. I won't go over every aspect of the articles at all. If you're interested in them, please give them a read. So this one, what is emotional contagion theory? Definition and examples. You may recall that when I talked about empathy and the empathy trap, I also mentioned the danger of emotional contagion for people who try and help but then kind of get sucked into that emotional quagmire. So I thought it might be useful for us to broaden the scope in one way in terms of emotional contagion and also attempt to figure out what is going on. So, from that article, emotional contagion occurs when someone's emotions and related behaviours lead to similar emotions and behaviours in others. Awareness of emotional contagion is important for managing our own emotions and related actions and to assure our well-being and that of others. Absolutely, I think awareness is key, as it is in many aspects of our lives. So what is it? If someone approaches us with a smile, we have a natural tendency to smile back. If they approach us with a frown, the tendency is to frown too. Such mimicry of smiles, frowns or other emotional expressions often happens within milliseconds and without our being fully conscious of it, Wood et al. 2016. By mimicking others' facial expressions, we can tap into how they're feeling and experience similar emotions ourselves. So that's interesting, and I think that's true. But is that what is going on exactly with emotional contagion? Could that remotely explain the textile manufacturer, the girls' school and those fainting episodes? Well, let's crack on. We are then susceptible to behaving one way or another based on these emotions. So in other words, we mimic and we are susceptible to perhaps behaving in a way that's congruent with the emotions that we may be experiencing because we duplicated those facial expressions. Such emotional contagion can be negative or positive. When people are stirred to anger and violent acts by a demagogue, not a demigod, although they may think they're a demagogue, someone who stirs up division and normally against a group, the out-group could be the elite, and they use rhetoric, hyperbole and sometimes lies. So this demagogue, that would be an example of negative emotional contagion. On the other hand, when a corporate leader frequently smiles, is generally kind and positive towards employees, find this leader, please, and inspires positive feelings throughout the workforce, this would be an example of positive emotional contagion. Early research on emotional contagion emphasises basis in person-to-person contact and mimicry, including others' non-verbal cues such as tone of voice, gestures and facial expressions. Hatfield et al. 93. Research has found that such mimicry comes naturally to humans and other social creatures based partly on the existence of mirror neurons in our cerebral cortex. Now, that thing about mirror neurons, we're going to look at that again. And when I started putting together this little episode for you, I remembered I'd read some research that wasn't as happy to describe mirror neurons as to do with emotional contagion as some writers were initially suggesting. So we may come back to that, but we do need to look at mirror neurons and figure out what that may be. Mirror neurons are a class of neuron that modulate their activity both when an individual executes a specific motor act, kind of moving, and when they observe the same or similar act performed by another individual. So someone else does something and we seem to mirror the firing of those neurons that we would have fired if we had moved in that way ourselves. That's the theory. They were first reported in the macaque monkey ventral premotor area F5 and were named mirror neurons in a subsequent publication from the same group. I hope the macaque monkey agreed to that research. Ever since their discovery, there has been great interest in mirror neurons and much speculation about their possible functional role, with a particular focus on the proposed role in social cognition. And you notice here, this isn't social contagion, this is social cognition. And I think that mirror neurons definitely have a role to play in that. Social cognition, as the phrase kind of implies, is understanding our place socially. It's understanding what may be going on around us. So perhaps we see somebody use a tool and we imagine using it, and then when we get to it, we're maybe more familiar with using it in one way because we've sort of half imagined it, or indeed it may allow us to learn from that social group and we think, oh yeah, I saw them using that tool, I can apply my imagination to use it in a different way. So all sorts of things around cognition, but this is not contagion. This is not what this writer, these writers are talking about. So let's go here to this article. Social contagion, how others secretly control your behaviour, which is an interesting title. Social contagion is a subtle and sometimes unwitting spread of emotions or behaviours from one individual to others. So, echoing what's been written before. Emotional contagion is the spread of emotions through crowds and is the reason why a movie seems funnier if we are watching in a crowded theatre as opposed to watching it alone. I think that's true, actually, and you do tend to laugh a bit more. I do, but that's just me. Maybe I'm the only one laughing in the theatre. Bit of insight there. Our mood is influenced by those laughing around us, yes, or screaming, or gasping, or whatever. The movie experience is different. Most of us would agree. That's the theatre, the cinema. The same process would cause a stampeding wave of fear if someone were to suddenly yell fire in the crowded theatre. Yes, indeed, that is very likely. Behavioural contagion is a process by which other behaviours are replicated. So from the same article, what we're just getting on to here is some other subsets, I'm going to call them, that you may have heard of, but to put emotional contagion into context. So behavioural contagion is this process where behaviours are replicated. This explains fads such as the Rubik's Cube craze of the 70s or the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge that you may well have taken part in. And those are behaviours. I think there's an emotional context to it as well. Fear of missing out perhaps, and also wanting to help in the Ice Bucket Challenge, a great cause. But it is behavioural contagion primarily, not as much emotional. So let's then go here, and there we have hysterical contagion, such as the June bug incident. So this writer's actually referencing what I talked about earlier. Or the epidemics of dancing manias in the Middle Ages. Raves, I think they're called, as people would spontaneously dance until exhaustion. One such episode, Tarantism, Chris Tarrant, no, was believed to have been caused by tarantula bites. Probably not true, although maybe, dancing in fear or pain or horror. But no, I don't think that's what was causing the dancing. But the idea here is that it wasn't just one person. It could be groups, or there would be one person, then another person, maybe the next day, and the idea is that they were influenced in some way, that it wasn't indeed a tarantula. Contagions of aggression. riots, the recent spate of smash and grab robberies and the like. And these continue. I think there are other reasons for things like that happening, but let's stick with what's written here for the moment. Rule violation contagions. An example of this is when people observe other drivers speeding on the highway and they start to speed themselves. So it might explain instances of doping that occur in waves among some professional athletes. Again, yeah, maybe. I'm not sure that those are the best examples. I think it could be that, but I think other things are going on. And in consumer behaviour contagions, this is responsible for the buying crazes that occur, such as the run on toilet paper. Mentioned that in a video. I couldn't believe that it occurred at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, I'm not sure it's a contagion. I think that's probably more that is hysteria and selfishness and stupidity. Anyway, the Beanie Babies craze of the 1990s. Oh, remember them? And the hula hoops craze of the 1950s, which still goes on to this day. I'll have you know. I was never very good at it, actually. Financial contagions, self-explanatory. Oh, okay. This explains the Great Depression and the run on banks that occurred in 1929, as well as the economic recessions and financial crises that occur every few years. And what I would say here is that there's definitely an emotional element involved, but one could argue that there are other things involved and it's not necessarily primarily emotional, which I think is the reason for parsing it out in this way. So let's look again at this article. Mirror neurons were first discovered in the 1990s. Italian neuroscientists showed that the same neurons in monkey brains, the macaque, I think we might recall, fired when a monkey grabbed an object as when they watched another monkey grab the object. And similar mirroring processes occur between humans. When you sit by yourself and smile about some pleasant experience, this kindles certain neurons in your brain. Hopefully not kindles them exactly, but anyway, when another person smiles at you, this kindles many of the same neurons that fired when you smiled on your own. And yeah, fair enough. So we're back to these mirror neurons once more. Though these specialized neurons and the networks help explain how humans can mirror each other, including our emotions. And this is the bit that I was so pleased was in this article, because it's been reviewed. This is what happens to articles when they're republished. The reviewer's update: mirror neurons in humans are not well understood, and it is not known the extent to which they play a role in replicating emotions. And the mirror neurons, like all science, good science, there are these questions around, is that what's happening? I think the examples from the macaque monkey, I think the examples of people mimicking and maybe experiencing those emotions, as we'll see, are really perhaps less to do with the mirror neurons themselves, and more about the fact that we mimic what's going on and then what happens in the body. And we'll get on to that. So I'm really glad that reviewer put it in, because there was a tendency by some writers, based on what the research was at that point in time, to suggest that it was some kind of magic thing that we just look and these emotions appear. And quite patently, that's not true, because there are many examples where this stuff doesn't work. That contagion isn't there for different reasons. So we're on to this article: emotional contagion. What is it and how to avoid it? Hatfield, 93, notes that people automatically and continuously mimic and synchronize the facial expressions, voices, postures, movements, and instrumental behaviours of others. That's when they play instruments, presumably. Same article: college students, as one study showed, can synchronize their facial movements within 21 milliseconds. It doesn't mean to say that there's a race there. This is that, get ready, go, synchronize. It's sort of happening automatically, and that's from Hatfield, 93, who I believe came up with the phrase emotional contagion. Other researchers have found that infants mimic facial expressions shortly after birth. this pattern of mimicry Hatfield observed is not limited to facial expressions. And that's astounding. I mean, that's probably worth a whole separate conversation, that infants mimic facial expressions shortly after birth. How? What is going on there? Where's that ability stored? And why is it useful? Well, it's useful because you build up empathy and care, and probably other reasons as well. So, for example, conversational partners who rate their conversations positively show similar speaking durations, rate of speed, and latencies of response. Similar behaviour has been observed in posture and general body movements. Again, that's Hatfield. Again, Hatfield, emotional contagion and facial feedback. So Hatfield also proposes that the activation of and feedback from facial, vocal, postural. I was posturing too much on the postural and it came out postural. And movement mimicry can affect the subjective emotional experience. What does that mean? And this, I think, you may find also interesting. So we'd sort of start with the end in some senses. Regardless of the method of inducing facial expressions, researchers have found that the emotional experience of their participants tend to be affected by their facial expressions. So in another study, Ekman et al., that's Professor Paul Ekman, the TV program Lie to Me, Tim Roth I think was in it, was based on a lot of his work. So Professor Ekman, his researchers asked participants to produce one of 6 emotions: surprise, disgust, sadness, anger, fear, or happiness, by reliving an emotional past event or arranging their facial muscles to mimic these expressions. So they relive it and they feel this potentially. So, you know, imagine that happy time. They relive it and then they feel it. Or arrange the facial muscles to mimic the expressions of those core emotions. They then measure the activity of the autonomic nervous system, which controls physiological processes associated with emotions such as heart rate and blood pressure. The researchers found that both reliving emotional experiences and flexing facial muscles produced effects in the autonomic nervous system equivalent to feeling those emotions. So by reliving, then this changes the autonomic nervous system, but by flexing the facial muscles deliberately, then they can also have they can feel those emotions, and this would also produce the same effects in the autonomic nervous system. Building off this communications research, one study from Hatfield et al. 93 showed that when asked to replicate sound patterns with characteristics associated with joy, love, anger, fear, or sadness, these emotions impacted those of the participants. So there's also something about how we communicate vocally, what those sounds are like. And I guess it's no surprise, is it? And if we go back to a slide that we've looked at already, emotional contagion and facial feedback. Hatfield, 1993, also proposes that the activation and feedback from facial, vocal, postural, and movement mimicry can affect the subjective emotional experience. I think this is so true. And if we then think about those mirror neurons, what do they allow us to do? They allow us to mimic, to say, hey, let me feel how that may be felt and imagine it, and then go and try that out. And it's not going to be exact, but if that's the case, if we can do that, and if we can mimic facial expressions, which we do, and if those facial expressions, alongside perhaps tonality, movement, posture, if all of those change how we feel, can generate or put an overlay at least of an emotion into a situation, then is that how emotional contagion works? I think it is, at least in part. So it's not the mirror neurons exactly, but I think they're in the mix, in my opinion. And other research may already have come out, maybe some new stuff happening right now. But if you think about it, we're tribal by nature. And if we're tribal by nature, then when we see a group of people running towards us and they're fearful and they're falling over, then that's going to have a huge change. It's going to cause a huge change, I should say, in our own nervous systems, is it not? Because we need to run as well. It looks like there's danger. But if we're not running, if it's not exactly fight or flight, do we pick up these other things? And do changes in our emotional, psychological states show up? Can they manifest physically? Well, of course they can. And this is probably what's been happening with the textile manufacturer and the mimicking in the girls' school to a degree. Some of it may literally have been that, but I think a lot of it has been looking at people and going, oh my gosh, that looks awful, and feeling the same level of panic and fear. Why some of the symptoms would be similar? Well, because people have got similar autonomic nervous systems. Not exact, but similar. And some of the symptoms were varied across the girls. So why is that important to us? Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. I think that we need to be careful about environments that are toxic. I think we need to be careful about jumping on the bandwagon and thinking emotionally and getting a little bit hysterical about things, because we're not stepping back, we're not thinking rationally, we're not thinking critically. And of course, some environments, including work, you know, the leader who just looks miserable can transmit that misery, and people can find it difficult to raise their spirits, to ultimately, funnily enough, to be productive, which I always think is an odd thing for organizations to have in place, a sort of miserable, fearful environment. But, you know, some people are, in my opinion, just wrong. Anyway, the other thing that we need to be aware of are the environments that out with work that we can consider to be useful for us in terms of nourishing, or depleting for us in terms of emotionally draining. And whilst we may not always be able to escape those environments, we've got to take measures to ensure that we put in little counterpoints and antidotes to them. As I've mentioned before in the empathy video, exercise if possible, getting outdoors, and maybe getting to the cinema and laughing with other people. And also, I think those people that we can connect to, where we can mimic or share in some laughter, we can share in some hopeful stories, we can get engrossed in things. All of those things allow us to put ourselves in a position where we're not sucked in to that negative environment and inadvertently mimicking it and therefore feeling it. And that's why I think it's important to be aware of emotional contagion, or the hysteria, if you want to call it that, or indeed the groupthink, the echo chamber. None of that is good for us. We're individual, we're unique, we should come to our own conclusions, but to allow us to do that, we've got to step back a little bit emotionally. And when we're in those challenging environments, work, caring, coaching, mentoring, social community, whatever it may be, when it's challenging, make sure that you get out of it and not only do the self-care, but put yourself in situations where you're getting that positive experience from the environment. And if you mimic that, well, that can only be a good thing.